evening. I threw my face up on the first slide there because I thought, well, if you're like me, there's a lot of people that you see around the track during the year, but you don't always have the ability to put face to names, but you might recognize that face if you haven't seen me around the track, or maybe we have, and some of the names I do recognize. As John mentioned, my background comes at this from a lot of different angles. I started back into the sport about 12 or 14 years ago with the restart of the St. John Track Club, which had been dormant. I've been involved with as chair of Athletics New Brunswick. I've also been involved with sort of the general manager of the university program at UNB, coach at a high school. I'm involved with our club becoming a club excellence certified, which I'll talk a little bit about, but only briefly. And then also somehow found myself in the chair at Athletics Canada. I remain active at the club level with the St. John Track Club. I am still the president, and I am still one of the primary coaches, mostly on the endurance side. So, what I talk about tonight is pretty practical and based upon, I guess, the lessons learned sort of from my point of view. I put this presentation together back in the fall for something that was being done in Moncton at the fall sort of get together that they had there, and unfortunately due to a conflict that came up in the spur of the moment, I was unable to deliver it. So it's a pleasure to be able to do so now. The objective really tonight is, to discuss things that, that might make clubs successful. It's not quite as easy to be interactive here, but if somebody wants to jump in and ask a question, feel free to try, and we'll do what we can to do that, to kind of share my own club experiences and how that's worked, look at some of the ideas that might help your own club, and then, sort of some suggestions about some goals for 2018. I sort of view my club work as sort of a continuous improvement exercise. So every year with our club, I kind of think, okay, what can we try to do a little bit better, and put a few objectives down for our board to work on. John's topics for discussion were sort of board structure and importance, recruiting, retention, coaches, volunteers, and fundraising and marketing. And I'll cover those, not necessarily in that order, but if at any point, as I say, you want to butt in, feel free. To me, there's sort of three priorities for building successful clubs. And I'll wind back the clock for me to about 14 years ago when I had a son that was 9 or 10 years old who wanted to be involved in track, and there was no club, and I made a phone call, why wasn't there a club? And next thing you knew, we were running a club. We sort of brought one back to life that had been dormant. And we were talking about trying to build a board and have a plan and do a bunch of things. And Dave Thomas, who some of you may know, was the retired technical director for New Brunswick, said, why don't we just have a practice? Let's just schedule some practices and get started. And that's really what we did. And so a lot of what I felt I've learned, if I've learned anything over the last 12, 14 years, is that the most important thing, 40% of your club, is really programs, practices, competitions, and offering well-planned, well-thought-out programming. That all the governance in the world won't grow your club. It's really all about the programs and what you do. And that's why you'll see quite often clubs that spawn, that come up, that are the foundation is a really motivated and exciting coach, and everything else sort of follows that. So that's and I arbitrarily picked 40% because really the other 40% is the people side. 80% of this is what kind of programs you offer and the types of people you have that drive that attract it. We've jokingly said within Athletics Canada is that we could probably parachute a really good coach into Churchill, Manitoba, and within a month or two, they probably find some athletes and have a track club started, because that's how it works. It's the people and the programs and that philosophy around attracting athletes that makes it work. And that's the biggest part of having successful clubs. And so that'll drive some of what I talk about here. And then really the other 20% is the governance side. And governance is really about good business practices, transparency, where so you can have trust, that people trust what you're doing, and finance is sort of a part of that, etc. So I'm going to try to hit on those areas and kind of go over it, but that's sort of, 2 parts programs, 2 parts people, 1 part governance is sort of the way it all works. And none of it's complicated, as Gabe Leblanc would say here in New Brunswick in his French crazy accent. It's not rocket surgery. It's hard work, but none of this is complicated in terms of having a successful club. One of the biggest issues that I see with regards to club sustainability in my own club and in most others is one sheer fact, is that there's usually 1 or 2 key people that if something happened to you or them or us, if it's you, your club might disappear. Just about every good club I know, most of them in the country have a high reliance on one or two real drivers, spark plugs that make the thing go. And so a lot of what we're trying to do is, one, support and sustain people like that, but also build structures that can hopefully survive if they do get tired, if they do burn out, or if they need to move on, or something happens. So that's sort of the things you see a lot of in this sport, is that there's a few key people that drive a lot of organizations, but that, they're very vulnerable to that if something happens to them. And those 1 to 2 people, they're the spark plugs, they're passionate, they're obsessed, but they're also as rare as champion athletes. They're like that one kid, girl, boy that walks into your field or your track and it just is outstanding. Well, that's what these volunteers are like. And they're often been the behind the scenes person that made a club start in the first place. So what you're often trying to do is figure out how you can then sustain beyond those 1 or 2 people and build it bigger and build it more permanent. And so that's been a lot of the work we've tried to do here in St. John the last few years, to create permanence around what we hope is a strong club. In preparing this presentation, I did what I often do when I'm looking for information. I went and asked Mr. Google, what's out there in terms of building strong sport clubs, and there is all kinds of stuff. There's as many different things as you want. There's, all kinds of links to best practices for running successful sport clubs. They could be soccer, they could be track, they could be whatever, but there's really not a lot new to it, but there's lots of tools out there, and I would encourage you to do that. 3 components of successful youth sport clubs: coaching support, governance and leadership, operations administration. That was an article that's out there on the net, and I'll send this around so people can look at them. There's a whole model out of the UK. There's books from Human Kinetics that talk about sport club management, and that you can buy and read. And although it's dry stuff, provides good aspects. And on your own website, you have a good club development model there that talks about the types of things you need to be looking at in terms of developing it. So there's a lot of tools out there. None of this is new, but it does take some work to sort of put it in place and make it work. So what makes a strong club? Great coaches, athletes that are motivated and want to come, some volunteers, some quality programs, some facilities. You see clubs all across the country that do it without facilities. Even in Ontario, I run into people every day that are training in gyms and hallways that don't have access to tracks. We tend to think that's a maritime problem sometimes, but it's not. It's unique. It happens everywhere. I also believe that events are important. We put a lot of emphasis in this sport on training, but we don't put as much on having events and having events in our local community that our kids can participate in. Kids come to sports to play soccer, to play volleyball, to compete in track and field. And we want to make sure we create easy access events for them to be able to do that as part of your club programming. Money is important. I'll profess up front, I'm not a person that typically obsesses about money, but I watch money all the time. So those two things kind of contradict each other. But I always look for opportunities for our club to apply for government programming if we have it. I try every year to keep our club membership fees moving up a little bit to just cover off increasing costs and inflation. We make sure that we have enough money to operate, and we do have a financial statement so that we know we brought in more than we took out. And when we restarted our club 14 years ago, I was fortunate to find the old treasurer and president who had, believe it or not, $10,000 sitting in a bank account waiting for someone to restart the club. And my goal is to never go below that amount. That was sort of our nest egg, and my responsibility, and our club's board was responsible for trying to keep that. So we've worked to try to always maintain money, and sometimes we've made money off events and those types of things. Strong training groups are sometimes seen as clubs, but I know a lot of training groups around the province that are, one or half a dozen athletes and a coach, and they're valuable, they're very effective sometimes for folks, but that's not the same as a club. A club needs to be more than just a training group. Our club is made up of multiple training groups, but in the end, in order for a club to really build the sport in the community, it needs to have more. It needs to have a focus around coach development. It needs to have more than one coach, in my belief. It's got to have some sort of well-defined programs, training, and events. It's got to have an outreach and an awareness in the community, and it's got to have a few management practices around it to make sure that it works effectively. And so it's more than just that one little training group. And you see around the country, there's clubs that are highly developed. You know, the Lions in Ottawa, a huge organization with fairly mature structure, down to all across the country, whether it's Calgary or big communities and small training groups that are one coach and a small group of athletes. To me, that's a valuable service, but it's really not a true club in the sense that you're not building a structure that's sustainable beyond that one coach in most cases, and that's the risk. So with the club funding model, looking at funding is sort of a starting point. Our funding sort of breaks down very much like this. It's 75% of what we get from our athletes comes from membership and programming fees. So we have standard membership structures are fairly low, and we also have programs that they pay a fee for and do some things with as well. We require our athletes to self-fund most things that they go to. We have a fairly large number of recreational athletes that don't compete that often, so we don't ask them to subsidize the higher end athletes that want to travel more. We try to keep them to fund a greater percentage of their own travel costs. Our athletes pay their own cost to events, so they want to go to a meet, they pay their own fees, and typically with the way Tracky Reg works today, they pay their own fees, and we know they're coming. And then really another 10% of our club budget comes from, whether it's program funding, occasionally we can get through something with the government, the city, the towns in our area, and a few small sponsors that do some things each year. Now, we've had a few years. We hosted a major Masters event one year where we had a massive amount of donors and sponsors, which we used to supplement our equipment base here in St. John, and did about $100,000 investment in replacement of old equipment. But that's very out of the ordinary. This is very typical. So when you look at this, one thing you'll know, we don't do any fundraising. And as a club, we never have. What we've tended to do is get our members to self-fund, and if we stumble across a particular athlete that needs assistance or a family that needs assistance, we help them, and we usually have someone that's willing to help them, and or we find a way. And so generally that's how we've approached it. And St. John has a very high poverty rate, a number of challenges in that area. We tap into occasionally funding for athlete memberships through some of the funding programs and Pro Kids that we have here, but generally we're able to do this and have most of them fund their own. Part of the reason we don't do fundraising is because we find the costs for our sport aren't that high, but also we've made a decision to allocate our club's membership volunteer hours into helping at events and doing other things with us and trying to use their volunteer effort in other areas. So my first recommendation to anybody with a club, and this goes back to sort of what I learned when Dave Thomas and I got things restarted, was, have a defined program, have a clear program that, is focused on the level of competitiveness of the athletes that you have. Are they recreational towards more competitive, Legion age, university age? What are they? Or if they, all those things, make sure you have a program that kind of responds to each of those different levels. We have a very well-developed sort of run, jump, throw introductory program that starts at age 7, and we cycle a lot of kids through that program. Some never go on and do track after age 10, but we operate, and we have a lot of kids that come to our program and remain active. We operate in all 3 seasons. So our age groups in our club are 6 to, they expire. Our oldest member right now would be 76 as a Masters athlete. And so we go to all ages, and we have had some para athletes as well as some special O athletes join us over the last few years as well. We do programming that follows all seasons and has clearly defined beginning and end dates. So for example, our summer season will start at the end of April. It'll end when the kids go to Legions, and we'll have a break. We run a training season for speed power athletes in the fall, starting in October, and we do a cross-country season, and we do an indoor season with clearly defined breaks in between where our coaches get to basically be offline and not have to do anything. And that's as much for all of our sanity as anything. We work to make sure we have events that we run, and we work with A and B because there's really only two major tracks in New Brunswick that host events. St. John's one of them. We work closely to host events. And then we've identified who in our organization, whether it's parents or otherwise, can help us. And we look out into our community at what are the markets that we can serve. Can we tap into school programming? We provide open practices, for example, for middle school and high school athletes, and draw membership from that usually each year. And then we have our programs on our website, which essentially provides pretty good breakdown. And they're set each year. They don't change much other than the start date. And we usually put our fees up each year. So we have a spring and summer, we have a winter indoor, we have a fall programs. And at this point, that's extensive as we do. Our winter season right now is fairly constricted because of facilities, but when we get our new facility, we're going to grow that significantly. So those are important to us. And when you look at sort of how you're going to structure programs, it's very important to sort of, we all know the long-term athlete development model and things, but I just really take a very clear customer focus that if we have young kids in a program, it's got to be a fun program that's not all about hardcore training. But if you do happen to have that 10-year-old that's motivated and wants to do a little more, you got to try to satisfy them and move them up a little level, higher level, maybe to a next level program. And you can see how the Lions do theirs. In New Brunswick, we typically do 2 or 3 levels, a run, jump, throw level, a junior development level, and after that they break into event groups, usually from about, depending, 12 to 13 on, Legion age and on for sure. But that's important that you have a structured program, because this is the key as well to having volunteers know what they do. To attract volunteers and helpers and coaches, they need to understand the commitment, and they want it to be sort of manageable and not just vague. So if I was to give you some advice for 2018, it's improve your programs. Make sure your practices are strong and well organized, that there's a club feeling, team element to it. Find a way to host a few competitions, for even if it's just for your club or neighboring clubs. Provide some special training opportunities for coaches. Provide a few trips. Look at whether you can incorporate road racers, road runners, other people into it, and see if you can eventually move to sort of all seasons if you don't already do that. And maybe you already do, in which case that's good. Then we market our programs. We try to get them out. Right now we're using a little bit of Facebook advertising. We're doing a bit of promotion through the school system. And then really, if we get our normal levels of membership into these programs, they tend to be self-funding through fees. And then programming success at the club level depends on really knowing who the customer is, the time frame, deliver the program, and what skills you need to support it. And that helps you attract your volunteers with good, clear, defined roles. So I try to set 1 to 2 programming goals each year. We've only done a fall program with cross country outside of school. A lot of us coach at school, but we've been doing that for a few years, and we get 80 to 100 kids out in the fall for a fall cross country program. They pay us a club fee, they do stuff. It's a fairly unstructured recreational running program, gets them active, and then we have a few of them that are highly competitive, and we just manage that group and provide it. The one thing I will say about our programs that's a little different is we never worry about how many we get. We'll take as many as will come. And I know that sounds really weird, but it's because at a certain level, we treat them like a herd. And we coach them as a big group, and we have a lot of kids that are sort of recreational, want to have fun, and want to sort of be there as more of almost like a team sport environment. So we like having big numbers. So a typical practice for us in May, June in St. John, there could be 115, 120 kids at that practice. So who came first, coaches or the athletes? And do volunteers come before the athletes or with the athletes? That's sort of one of the things people often say, is that I can't afford to have any more kids because I don't have anybody to help me. Well, often, if we do it right, my experience is if you attract more athletes, you can also get some helpers, because some parent in that group will come out and help. So the second part, and there's only 3, so if you're worried about how long this goes, there's really only 3 components of this. The second part of this is about recruiting people, coaches, volunteers, athletes, and the trick to that today, it's clear from all the research that people want to come for well-defined tasks, activities, and programs. you might get lucky and get that former track athlete that walks up to you and says, I really want to coach and I know exactly what I want to do. I want to help with hurdles or something. But in the end, they're awesome when they come, but you also need some parents that are just willing to come and help out, to be on the track, to supervise younger kids if you're doing that, and be involved, maybe timing some practices or helping just make sure that if you're doing hurdle drills, helping set hurdles up, those types of things. But when you think about recruiting coaches, you got to kind of think about sending a mass email out to your membership and saying, we need help, usually doesn't get you much. You have to think about the profile of the good volunteers, the good coaches that you've seen in your life, and think about your parent base or your former athlete base, and do some talent identification. Just like thinking about an athlete. We can all go around the gym and spot somebody we think might be a good track athlete. We have to sort of use that same approach in recruiting volunteers and trying to find people and giving people a role. So, and amongst our membership in a club that typically has a couple hundred members in a season in a year, we probably get 25% of them to volunteer. We don't get anywhere near 100%. But we get 25 or 30 or 40 or 50 people that come out and volunteer between competitions and somewhat with practices. So think about that. What attracted the best athletes? How do you get the right athletes? And how does this apply that same approach to attracting volunteers and coaches? What would make them come? The graph at the bottom is actually from our new high performance director at Athletics Canada. And the bottom part is in his presentation, and that he talks about the importance of what happens at the club and school athletics and all of that stuff that sort of builds the athlete base and the talent pool for the future of our sport. What we do in terms of providing a positive experience for parents, volunteers, and athletes is important because it sets the tone for whether kids stay in our sport and stay competitive. So, being professional about how we approach volunteers is important too in terms of how people feel valued. I pulled these slides off a national thing about volunteers and recruiting them. And today's volunteers, everybody's busy. We talk about the world like everybody's busier today than they've ever been. I don't know if that's true. My mother had 5 kids, and half the people on our street had 6 and 7 kids. They were pretty friggin' busy back then too. So I look at it, parents and older athletes, et cetera, have always been busy holding down part-time jobs. And but really, when you look at the trends, many of the volunteers that we seek out are employed, actively working. They're students. They may have young families. They're prepared to commit if they were insist, but they probably are not going to be that lifer that works in our sport forever. They're interested in challenging assignments, but if they don't know much about our sport, it's easy for us to scare them away. So we need to be careful about how we draw people in and how we get them involved, because they can very easily find that they don't know much about track and field. It's a little different today than our generation, my generation, where everybody did every sport. We're running into more and more parents who may not have done our sport. So, design shorter term sort of positions that say, we need you for 4 to 6 weeks to help with this. Provide group volunteer activities because people like to work with others. Target particular people, retired people, ethnic groups. If you're having an event, there's some ways to reach out and attract volunteers within your community. Be flexible about the hours and the locations. Don't expect they're going to work as hard as you or your head coach, because they probably won't. But accept that and be glad for what they can give, and then organize a way that people can be backed up, that that I'm very fortunate. I coach a fairly large group, but I have a co-coach, and he and I back each other up. And we've built that system because we both needed it. And I would encourage you to do that with your volunteers. Have more than one person that can help you in a particular area. The other thing that people clearly say is they want clearly defined jobs. They want to know something specific that they could do that's of value to the club. They want those jobs to be assigned carefully and thoughtfully. They want you to help them a little bit and teach them, and give them the authority to do it and recognize it when they do it well. And that's what makes this hard, because it's quite often easier for us to just do it ourselves than to go to that effort. But frankly, we need to go to that effort at least a certain number of times a year and attract people and have them come. So Be careful of how you assign volunteers, careful how you train them, you know, don't overwhelm them, give them something they can work at. But there's an awful lot of people that come to our sport with a lot of knowledge that are highly successful professionals in their regular job. And let's face it, we can put them to work and allow them to be, and with a little bit of instruction, probably trust them to do the job very well. So goal number 2 is really find 1 to 3 new volunteers, coaches, helpers for your club this year. And there's an article I found on the net, so that was pretty good, was beware of the 7 deadly sins of recruiting volunteers. So don't expect announcements to get people, because they don't. It's sort of like junk mail. We just go delete. Go it alone, thinking people will step up. So don't just think people will, out of the goodness of their heart, come to you. They're more likely going to sit on their butt and drink their Tim Hortons coffee. So, you know, don't be prepared to seek out people. Don't expect to recruit those lifetime volunteers. Be happy with some short-term project groups. Don't assume that no means never. Ask them again, because it might have been just a bad time in their life, or too busy, or they had another commitment. Or maybe sometimes, like in sales, it takes more than one ask to get them to say yes. Don't put too many people in that butt in the chair trap where they have boring jobs and no purpose so that they don't want to come back. Try to give them something that they're comfortable with. And there's some people that like those jobs because they're often important, even though they might be boring, but try to get people into things they'll enjoy. Be position driven. So find people to do certain things, you know, find people to help the starter, find people to do hurdles, find people to do your registration for your club, find people to be your treasurer. Be specific about that. And don't give the title, the position, the wrong job title. So quite often titles cause confusion. So think about 1 to 2 to 3 people you could find. We've tried to do this every year. Some years we're successful. Some years we only find 1. Some years we find none. Last year we made a commitment to try to find 3 new coaches. We didn't, to be honest. We all struck out. We're going to go back at it again and try to find 1, 2, 3 coaches again to join the team. And ultimately be a mentor and teacher for those volunteers. Make it a positive experience. If you're like me, I, for one, have gotten more out of this sport than I feel I've given it. It's been a huge part of my life, and I think other people can get that enjoyment too. And the good volunteers we attract, usually that's what they tell us, that they've enjoyed it, enjoyed what they've learned, and they've enjoyed being part of it. I left governance to the end, because although it's incredibly important, to me, it's sort of, you can actually have successful clubs even if you don't have, if you have the right intentions, but not necessarily strong governance practices. And I see that time and again. Kitchen table clubs that run very, very well with strong programming and good coaching, and don't have a lot of organization. To be honest, for the first 8 years we ran our club, we ran it on 3 meetings a year. We met at the beginning of each season with the coaches and a few other key volunteers, and then we set our season up and away we went. And then anything else we needed to deal with, I dealt with Dave and I and a couple other key people sort of steered the rest of the show. So good governance does matter. It'll strengthen your club. Today, in the world we live in, with issues of inclusion and people's concerns about trust and transparency and the handling of money, if you have a strong club that has some good business practices and a board that kind of leads it, you know, even if it's smaller, it provides a level of transparency and confidence in your organization. If you're going to seek out donors or sponsors or government money, it also provides that same confidence that you're just not a one-person show or overly controlled by, you know, a few people. It provides good oversight of safety. We're becoming more and more under the scrutiny about making sure we're not putting athletes into risk of harassment or some other such thing. We've all heard the news over the last year. With a club board, you can at least work to build in some of that safety and credibility around your processes. And if you are one of the key decision makers in the club, it decentralizes decision making away from you for just 1 or 2 people. It puts decision making in the hand of a slightly bigger group, which is really a much better situation for you from a personal liability point of view. And my belief, and the biggest reason we strengthened our club practices a bunch of years ago, was because we felt it had a greater chance of having succession to new leadership down the road should I move on or somebody else move on as sort of the president of the club. It built a structure we felt might be more sustainable. So we took on the Club Excellence program, which frankly was at the time a bit of a priority at Athletics Canada. It was about having standards to make your club stronger. They were overly difficult, and frankly, it was not a great program. It was sort of like getting an ISO 9000 certification, if you know anything about that. But it was not, I don't know that it really accomplished what they wanted. But I was sort of a bit of a stubborn guy, so we did it anyway. The one thing I will say about governance is it rarely builds your club. No one comes to a club specifically because they got a good board, but it protects your club. It protects you from one person making decisions. It protects you in terms of it'll force you to put some better policies in place. It'll broaden the decision making. It'll do all the things I mentioned, but it's important. So I typically suggest people focus on a couple of key priorities. And again, if you have a good structure in place and it functions and you meet 4 or 5 times a year, then maybe you're really setting 1 or 2 key improvement goals, involving 1 to 3 other people. So having turnover on your board so it's not always the same people. Having good, effective meetings, even if you only have them seasonally. I never do a meeting without an agenda because otherwise I don't know when it's over. And most of my people I work with appreciate the fact that I try to keep meetings to an hour or 90 minutes and that we have an agenda, we work through the discussion, we keep it moving, and we get the job done, what we need to focus on. And we treat it as good business. We've moved to delegating more decision, and the very least we've delegated finance decisions. So we actually have a little mini budget, so we know what we're sort of trying to work towards in a year. We have a separate treasurer that does all the books for us now. He's a parent who likes doing that, and we manage the finances that way. We've put in place safety and screening and risk management, which came from the Club Excellence side, where we have a policy about screening our coaches every few years, if asking for police checks and doing screening of new coaches that come. And we're trying to abide as well by sort of rule of 2 requirements where coaches are not working with athletes privately without another coach with them. To reference the Club Excellence program, which still exists and is, if you're a highly developed club with a program already in place, it may well be something you want to pursue. It essentially focused around 9 sport delivery things related to quality of programs, and then a bunch of management things that dealt with, if you had staff, like some of the big clubs have, soccer clubs particularly, and full-time staff, dealt with governance and financial accountability and screening and things like that, all the things that are there to make sure that you would have them in place each year. So it forces our board to make sure we have a screening process, that we confirm our insurance each year with a provincial association, that we have a record of that we have, that we disclose our financial information, that we have an annual meeting, that we do all those things. And it's been a good process for us because it forced me to share more of the leadership around that. And that was why we did it. I don't think the program's that well thought out. I'm not a big booster of Club Excellence, unfortunately, but if anybody, it's a good idea. The standards were a bit too high. The focus was a little too high level, and it was not quite practical enough in terms of those of us that work in a club every day. But it was a good exercise for us, and if anybody was interested in pursuing it, I would certainly be glad to help you because you could steal most of the policies and practices we put in place from our club. They're on our website, and just use them. And I'd be glad to help that, because the main lessons learned was it did force us to put in a more effective structure. Ultimately, if you're going to have a goal for the year, is to have a structure that doesn't have you going it alone as 1 to 2 people. And if you are going alone with 1, 2, 3 people, I would encourage you to sort of introduce somebody new into that mix each year, because I think that adds value. It forces you to bring a new parent or a new coach or somebody new to the table to be part of the decision making. And frankly, our original structure of having coaches meetings and sort of a few directors, for lack of a better term, every season 3 times a year worked even really well. We now meet about 5 times a year, but we could easily get by with 3 in an annual meeting. Improve your business practices, have some meetings. You don't need to have a lot of them, but when you have them, make them effective and have some things that you want to pursue, maybe some of these improvement objectives. Have a financial statement so that people know what's happening with the money in your club. It isn't just a black hole or an empty envelope or cash in a bag somewhere. Our club operates, because we operate, do a bunch of work with UNB as well, with a budget of $100,000. We're now at the point that we have to, we get financial statements done by an accountant, because we just feel we're handling other people's money, and there's a degree of accountability and transparency we want to have. And not everybody would certainly need to do that, but certainly being able to produce a financial statement, here's the money that came in, here's where it went, is important. As someone that does make donations to organizations, it's important to me, to know that the money's being spent well. The priority policies would be screening. The other thing I would suggest is that you get into the habit of having acknowledgement of risks or waivers, as we've traditionally known them, and having a lawyer or having an Athletics Nova Scotia assist you with making sure it's written properly. And I would have one that acknowledges those risks to your club and signs them, as well as in addition to any one you might have for Athletics Nova Scotia. So you'd want to have both. There's a case in the courts in Ontario right now where a person was hurt by a discus, coach actually, at an event run jointly by a club and Athletics Ontario. And, it just goes to show that there's a real need for these types of things. They don't necessarily prevent you from ending up in court, but it forces people to acknowledge that we're in a sport, that there are risks, and that could help in the event you ever had an unfortunate accident. You want to make sure you have your insurance in place, and you want to have some processes for communications to your members, which today with online and electronic, I think is easier than ever. It's 1 to 2 improvement goals with those. I threw this up at the end because I'm a big person personally for setting goals in my business and things I'm doing. I just kind of keeps me on track. And to me, I liken it to how we do, if we coach, we have a periodization plan, and we look at our athletes and we say, here's our goals. And we don't just wing it through the season. We know there's key events, competitions, there's things we need to do in the spring, summer, and fall to get ready. They're planned, they're intentional. And if we want to have strong clubs, our goals should be planned and intentional as well. So, set a couple of goals, even if it's 2, and work to try to achieve those. Periodize them. Figure out how you're going to get them generally planned out, specifically done and implemented, and just like you would with an athlete. And the best thing you can do is set some dates and say you're going to try to do this spring or this summer. And be intentional about making those improvements. It's easy to talk about stuff like this, and what I think tends to happen is we get too many things on our to-do lists every day, all of us, between our jobs and this volunteer life. But if you pick 2 things that you want to accomplish in your club this year, set some goals around some of those things I mentioned, you'll improve them, and you can always build on them next year. And that's sort of how we've done it here with our club with some serious success. So I think that's it. It is.